On this episode of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, join me as I discuss the gruesome discovery in an unused bank in a little country town called Snowtown that would uncover Australia's worst ever group of serial killers. Coming up right after this. Hello everyone. Welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans. I am your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome guys. Welcome to my little true crime podcast, my one gal true crime podcast where I talk about true Australian crimes, true Aussie murders caffeinated. Welcome to my podcast, guys. I so appreciate your company. And I want to say straight off the bat that I have been getting a few messages via YouTube and via Spotify. I do see them sometimes a wee bit too late, like quite a while after you've made the comment. I don't get notifications that you guys have commented sometimes. So please don't be offended if I don't reply, but I will always try and reply to you if I can. But I do love the feedback I'm getting from you guys, and I do love you guys letting me know where you're listening to me from. Like I've had a few people from Scotland and Finland say they were listening, so I love that. Thank you guys. Now, I also want to do a real quick where are you listening to me from, and like I said, we've got people from Finland and Scotland. We've also got Singapore and Zimbabwe, which is amazing. And of course, at the top, we have Australia, followed by New Zealand and the US. So love seeing where you guys are listening to me from. Please do keep it up. I love seeing where you're from. Now, if you, as you know, I drink coffee. If you want to buy me coffee I can drink it while I'm talking to you guys, that would be amazing. You can find me over on Buy Me a Coffee. You can become a sponsor if you do coffee syrups or coffee beans, or if you just feel that my podcast would be a fit for whatever you are in the business of. Please reach out. Let's have a chat. Let's see what we can do. And as usual, what am I drinking? I am drinking my black coffee with pumpkin cheesecake syrup. And I'm drinking this on a very bleak Wednesday afternoon. It's very rainy in my part of Australia. It is still really warm, like it is a few days away from winter, and it is still really warm, which I don't think I've ever experienced something like this before. I'm not complaining. I'm not a fan of the cold, but you know, winter's coming sooner or later. So, you know, let's just get on with it. Anyway, and as always, let's go to my sources. So my sources for this episode are smh.com.au, Seymour Telegraph, which is SEYMOURTELEGRAPH.com.au, theguardian.com, abcnet.au, webarchive.org, heraldsun.com.au, serialkillercalendar.com. Yes, there is really a website called that, and 7news.com.au. Now, this episode I've titled Bodies in the Barrels, the Snowtown Murders. Now, for many of us, you mentioned the name Snowtown and you know exactly what we're about to talk about or what went down there. And if you don't, buckle up, guys. You're in for a ride. So whatever you're doing, however you're listening to me, drinking a coffee with me, gymming, getting ready to end your night, getting ready to start your day, working, driving, jogging, walking the dogs, however you're listening to me, settle in, lend me your ears, and let's get stuck right into it. And I will say this, the people involved in this crime, it's all very incestuous, for want of a better word. These people were murdered by someone they considered a friend or an acquaintance, or they were part of their family, or in one case they were married to. So these weren't random murders where people were just plucked off the street by some random psycho. This goes deeper than that. These people actually knew the people who they were murdering. So there are a lot of names that are going to be thrown around. I did get mixed up with it as well. So please, if you need to, put me on pause, go back, try and catch up and write the names down, because I've had to do the same. It is quite there are a lot of players in this game, in this murder. So rewind me if you have to. I won't know, and nobody else will. All right, let's get into it. Okay, all murders, no matter if the victim is 1 or 10, is tragic and awful, and someone has lost their life and people have lost their loved ones. But sometimes a murder is more than a murder. Sometimes it is a full-blown murder spree where there's not only one perpetrator, but several. And you hear me say several times with killer couples, it blows my mind that these two people have managed to find each other. This episode, this crime, there was 3, there was 4. It blows my mind that this kind of evil can come together. And it happened right under a small country town's nose, and they didn't know. They didn't know anything was amiss until the awful truth was discovered one day when the police opened an unused bank in Snowtown. Now, let's get into it, guys. The bodies in the barrels, the Snowtown murders. Now, Snowtown is located in South Australia. In Australia, it is a small rural town in South Australia, located around 145 kilometres north of the state's capital, which is Adelaide. Now, it's your stock average small country town. One of its biggest claims to fame is that it has one of the longest football fields in the state. And for a while, that was all Snowtown was known for, but that all changed in 1999. Now, in the 90s, police were investigating the disappearance of a man by the name of Barry Lane. Now, Barry was 40 years old and he was a convicted pedophile. He had been convicted of sexual crimes against children, and he'd also identified as a woman, so he was transgender, and he went by the name Vanessa. Now, Vanessa went missing around 1997, and while the police were looking for her, they noticed something odd. There were quite a few people missing in the area, and more than a few of these people that were on the missing persons list were still claiming their welfare benefits. And I mean, how could you do that if you were missing? Because if you're claiming welfare benefits, you have to ring the welfare office or go there in person. So how could they be doing that if they were missing? And in some cases presumed dead. And if they were alive, like their bank statements showed them to be, why was there no sightings of them? So police investigated, and they soon found out that the missing people were all known to each other, and they were all known to a group of people. And they soon started monitoring the calls of 3 men. Now, the men in question were John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden. And they were also keeping an eye on a young man called James Vasilakis, and I hope I have said that correctly. And he ended up turning informant, but we will get into that later on. Now, the link with Vanessa, also known as Barry, had been in a relationship with Wagner at some stage, and they had lived together for around 8 years. Now, police were also tipped off about a suspicious rental of an unused bank in Snowtown, which the lease had both the names of 2 of these men on this lease. So acting on this tip-off, they raided it. Now, what they found would change the course of their investigation, leave a small town reeling, and leave Australia in the world in absolute shock. The smell of rotting meat hit them as soon as they entered that bank, and it was so strong they needed breathing gear. They had to go back and get breathing gear. And when they got the breathing gear, they went inside and they found 6 barrels filled with acid. In those barrels were 8 mutilated bodies. And not long after this horrific discovery, more bodies began to turn up in various locations near Snowtown, making the body count 12. Australia had a serial killer or serial killers on its hands, and one that had been killing people for years. And like I said earlier, the story, the truth was way worse than anyone initially thought it could be. Now, before I go into the perpetrators of these horrible murders, I'm going to talk about the victims first, because the victims were eventually identified, and I'm going to identify them now. First off, we have Clinton Trezise. He was 20 at the time of his death, and he was found buried in a shallow grave in Lower Light, South Australia. He was not in the bank, but he was killed by the same group. Next up, we have Ray Davies. He was 26 years old at the time of his death, and he too was found in a shallow grave in Salisbury, South Australia. Next up, we have Michelle Gardner. Now, Michelle was 19 and she identified as a transgender woman, and she was found in a barrel in the bank. Her left foot had been cut off so the barrel's lid could be shut. Vanessa Lane, also known as Barry, the transgender woman who kicked off this whole discovery, had been in a relationship with Robert Wagner and was found in a barrel in the bank and had been dismembered. Thomas Trevelyan, 18 and a partner to Vanessa Lane. He was found hanging from a tree in Humbug Scrub in South Australia, and his death was initially ruled a suicide until it wasn't. Gavin Porter, he was a 29-year-old heroin addict that was friends with the informant who blew the lid on this whole thing. He was found in a barrel in the bank. Next up was Troy Yaud, 21 and half-brother of James Vasilakis. He was strangled and his body was found in a barrel in the bank. Frederick Brooks, he was 18 and his body was found in the bank in a barrel on the 20th of May with the others. Gary O'Dwyer, he was 29 and found in a barrel in the bank. Elizabeth Hayden, she was 37. She was married to Mark and she was killed because she knew too much. She was found in a barrel in the bank. And David Johnson, he was 24 and he was actually killed inside the bank before being stuffed into a barrel. And he too was a family member of James Vasilakis. 12 people who police soon discovered were victims of simply knowing the wrong people, and they paid with their lives. And I will get to the circumstances of each murder, I promise, but this case is so complex and has so many tentacles, I thought it would be best to start and we can work our way back. Now, do you remember the 3 names I mentioned before? John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden. And I have mentioned this one's name a few times, James Vasilakis. Now, police were quick to connect the dots on the connection of these guys with the murder victims. And on the 21st of May, they were all arrested and charged with murder. On the 26th of May, James Vasilakis was arrested as well. He was also charged with murder, and he soon became informant. He went into a plea deal, and soon enough the full horrors of what happened to those poor 12 people came to light. Now, how were these guys caught? You know, you've got 4 serial killers knocking off people left, right and centre. How were these guys caught? How did they get away with it for so long? Now, I've managed to find dribs and drabs about how they were caught, and it seems that the murder at the time, it seems that on top of the disappearance of Vanessa, the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden is what really set alarm bells ringing. Now, Elizabeth was reported missing 4 days after she was murdered. And in November 1998, detectives launched an investigation, and Elizabeth was, launched an investigation. Elizabeth had small children. She would not just up and leave her kids, no matter what her so-called friends were telling the cops at the time. That they were telling the cops that she'd taken off with a boyfriend, which just was not true. Now, Elizabeth was married to Mark. She was also friends with Bunting and Wagner, and they were all questioned, and they were placed under police surveillance, but still managed to commit another murder while they were under surveillance, and that was the murder of David Johnson in May 1999, just before they were all caught, the half-brother of James Vasilakis. Now, so all this raised the alarm for the police. They were all linked. We've now got 2 people missing linked to the same little circle of people. And when the police found out that a bank in Snowtown was actually leased and the names on the lease were Bunting and Hayden, that was like a smoking gun for them. Now, when they raided that bank on that horrible day in May 1999, not only did they find those barrels containing the bodies, they found handcuffs, knives, gloves, and DNA. Not only did they kill and torture these poor people, where they could, they collected their welfare payments, or they took their cars, or they took their furniture. So not only were they revolting, despicable killers, they were low-life thieves. Thieves who stole from the dead. So who were the Snowtown killers? Who were these people? Okay, first up we have John Bunting. Now, John was born in 1966 and claimed he had been beaten and sexually assaulted by a friend's older brother when he was 8 years old. He grew to develop a strong hatred for pedophiles and homosexuals, and at age 22, he started working at an abattoir where he bragged about killing the animals. Apparently, he really enjoyed killing the animals. In 1991, he moved to Salisbury North, where he became buddies with Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden, and he was the dominant, overbearing ringleader. Now, Robert Wagner was born in 1971, and he was active in several neo-Nazi groups. He was just as unhinged and psychotic as John was, and I should say is, because both men are still alive. Now, James Vasilakis was born in 1971, and somehow he and his mother crossed paths with John Bunting, and they ended up, his mum and his half-brother ended up living with John Bunting at some point. Now, Mark Hayden was born in 1958, and he too was in the thick of the group, and his name was allegedly on the lease for the unused bank in Snowtown. Now, Bunting chose the victims, apparently. There was nothing random about who he chose. Now, he went after the disabled, both physically and intellectually. He went after drug users, obese people, gay people, people he thought were pedophiles, even though he had no proof. Pretty much anyone he deemed not good enough to breathe the same air as him was on his hit list. He had a rock spider chart on his wall in his home. And we've all seen the memes of the crazy person with the tinfoil hat, with the chart behind them, with the yarn, twisted around and going from one person to the next and something to the next. That is apparently what this thing looked like. And he would make notes and connect everything with yarn, much like what conspiracy theorists would do. And he had interconnected all the names of the people he thought were pedophiles. He would ring these people on their phone and threaten them whenever he felt like it, whenever the mood struck him. And soon enough, these psychotic evil tendencies of John's would spill over into murder. Now, I don't know how it came to be that, hey, we're going to go murder this guy, and everyone was on board. I don't know how that came to be. But the group's first victim was a man called Clinton Trezise. He was 20. He was gay, and according to Bunting, that was enough for him to not deserve to live. Now, Clinton was invited over for a catch-up with the boys on the 31st of August 1992. When he arrived, he was quickly set upon and beaten to death with a shovel. He was buried in a shallow grave in Lower Light, and Bunting's justification for this was he thought he was a pedo. And he would often refer to his murder as the murder of Happy Pants. Now, the group's next victim was a man by the name of Ray Davies. He was intellectually disabled, and he had been in a relationship with one of Bunting's ex-girlfriends. So that's how he came to get on their radar. Now, this girlfriend claimed that Ray had been sexually inappropriate with one of her grandsons. So she called off the relationship, but she was still friendly with Ray. In fact, Ray lived in a caravan at the back of her house. Now, Bunting got wind of the allegations of the supposed abuse of the grandson. So on Christmas Day in 1995, they paid him a visit in his caravan, where they stabbed him in the leg and strangled him before throwing him in the boot of the car and taking him to a house 90 minutes away. When they got there, they put him in a bathtub and proceeded to bash him in the genitals and strangled him with jumper leads. Now, at this stage, these guys had no clue. Apart from Bunting, these guys had no clue about the allegations that had been made against Ray, as the mother of this child who made the allegation had not told anybody apart from her mother, who then told Bunting. Now, this murder took place in a house where James Vasilakis' mother was present, and apparently she helped to strangle Ray. Now, James didn't mention his mother's involvement when he initially ratted out the group to the police because he wanted to protect her, but of course this all came out in the woodwork. This all came out in the evidence and the statements, but she would die before any action against her could be taken. Now, the motive for the murder of Ray was that he was a pedophile, and that was enough. The allegation that was kind of out there was enough, and Bunting would laugh about it. He would laugh about how they murdered him, how they murdered this man. And he also sold Ray's caravan after his murder to keep up the illusion that this man was still alive. So there was a transaction trail of him selling his caravan, pocketing the money, putting in his account, blah, blah, blah. Bunting even went as far as to pretend he was Ray at a caravan park to, so he could pull up and live there for a bit, and he changed his address several times and still accessed his welfare payments. So according to the system, according to this paper trail, Ray was still alive. Susan Allen was next up. She was 47 and she was found buried at Bunting's former house in Salisbury North. Now, Bunting and Wagner claimed she died from a heart attack before they dismembered and buried her. I mean, if you've died from a heart attack, why would you not just call the authorities? Why do you need to dismember and bury somebody? Now, when this went to trial, the jurors were unable to come to a conclusion, and the prosecution did not push for a retrial of her death. So she isn't considered in the official victims list, but she is widely considered as one. Next up, we have Michelle Gardner. She was a transgender woman and lived with a woman called Nicole Zurita, who was a cousin of Wagner's wife. And Wagner referred to Michelle as the biggest homo. Now, in September 1997, Michelle was playing with Wagner's kids in her front yard when she put her hand over one of the children's mouths, which infuriated Wagner, who apparently witnessed this whole thing. He's then gone to Bunting, where they've decided she's got to go. Bunting and Wagner took her to a shed in Murray Bridge, where they strangled her, forcing her to get up every time she collapsed. They then staged a robbery in her home, making it look like someone had come in and stolen all her stuff. They even went as far to steal her roommate Nicole's stuff, telling her that Michelle had come through and stolen everything to hock and pay for her gender-affirming surgery. Michelle's body was found in the bank in a barrel, where her right ear was covered by a slip knot in a rope that was wrapped around her neck, and her left foot had been cut off so the drum's lid could be shut. Vanessa Lane, also known as Barry Lane, was next. She was Wagner's ex-partner and was 42 when she was murdered. Now, Vanessa and Bunting had been living together for 8 years, and she identified as a woman. She was transgender, so I'm not sure if he was with her when she transitioned or before. Either way, he was in a relationship with someone he openly despised. So after they broke up, Bunting was really very open about his hatred for Vanessa and the fact that she had been previously convicted of child sex abuse, and this only added to the hatred. But he kept Vanessa around, as Vanessa would tell the group about the activities of the local pedophiles in the area. I don't know how she came across this information, but apparently she would tell them what they were up to, tell this group. Apparently Vanessa was accused of sexually abusing another friend of the group, and that was it. She had to go. Now, Bunting ordered Wagner and another man called Thomas Trevelyan, who lived with Vanessa for a few months, to pick her up in October 1997, where when they had her, they made her call her mother, telling her she was moving to Queensland and wanted nothing to do with her, before hanging up. Now, they then tortured Vanessa to get her bank account details, crushing her toes with pliers to get the information. And then when they did get what they needed, and after they made her reveal her PIN number and make a few more phone calls, they strangled her to death. Now, Bunting started driving her car around town, and he collected her welfare payments. Her body was found in a barrel in Snowtown. Now, the next victim was Thomas Trevelyan, who was 18, and he was Vanessa's partner or roommate, and he helped torture and kill Vanessa. Now, Thomas suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, which led him to believe he was a soldier, and he would get around town in army fatigue. In 1997, in November of 97, he tried to kill Wagner's girlfriend's dog with a knife, and that, combined with his declining mental health and the fact that he helped to kill Vanessa, so he knew too much, sealed his fate. He was a risk. He tried to kill a dog. He had to go. Now, he was driven to Kersbrook by Bunting and Wagner and was made to lean against a box, and put a noose over his head. He was found hanging from a tree in Humbug Scrub, and given his history of suicide attempts, the coroner at the time declared his death a suicide, but we now believe he was actually murdered by Bunting and Wagner. Next up was Gavin Porter. He was 29. He was a friend of Vasilakis, and also suffered from schizophrenia, which saw him in and out of mental institutions over the years. Now, after his mother died in 1997, he met and moved in with Vasilakis, where the pair quickly got hooked on heroin together. James didn't think Porter was a target for anything. Bunting never expressed his dislike for Gavin, and neither did Wagner. But that all changed when Bunting was pricked by a used needle that Porter had left on the couch in his living room, and that sealed his fate. So James was not part of this murder, but he was told that Gavin was murdered by Wagner and Bunting and that they had strangled him, but not before Gavin managed to stab Bunting in the hand with a screwdriver in an act of self-defense. Now, the pair showed Vasilakis, they showed James, Gavin's body before placing him in a barrel. Now, the barrel containing his body was eventually moved into the bank, and he was moved to the bank next to a barrel that contained the bodies of Gardner and Lane. Now, apparently, when they moved the barrel which contained Gavin's body into the bank, Bunting took the lid off the barrel that contained the bodies of Gardner and Lane and made the comment, "They're rotting very nicely." The trio then also went on to collect Gavin's welfare benefits after they had killed him. Next up was Troy Yowd. He was 21 and the half-brother of Vasilakis, and Vasilakis confided to Bunting that Yudi had sexually abused him when he was 13, which absolutely enraged Bunting. But Vasilakis, James didn't think he would actually murder him, but we now know different. One night in August 1998, Vasilakis was asleep on the lounge when he was woken by Bunting, Hayden, and Wagner, where they gave him some handcuffs, and the others were armed with a jack handle. They went to Troy's bedroom, where they just launched at a sleeping Troy, just absolutely started hooking right into him. Now, James left the room, and so did Hayden, but Bunting and Wagner did not. And they took Troy into the bathroom and put him in a bathtub where they continued to physically and verbally abuse him. They also demanded his financial information, and they forced him to record and repeat a string of numbers, words, and sentences, which all was recorded on tape. He was then gagged, and a rope was tied around his neck, and the jack handle was inserted into the rope as a twisting mechanism. Now, the rope broke, which pissed them off, and they just retied it, and the strangulation continued, but not before Bunting knelt in front of a dying Troy and told him how many people he had killed and who he had killed. And as they were carrying a dead Troy's body out of the house, Bunting laughed and said that Troy was happy now and that he had been made good. Frederick Brooks was next up. He was 18 and he was the son of a woman called Jodie Elliott, who was the sister of Hayden's wife and was in a relationship with Bunting. Now, several times Bunting referred to him as a pedo and dirty, but there was no talk of killing him, and when it actually did happen, it came as a surprise to Vasilakis. In September 1998, Frederick was at a party with Bunting, Wagner, and Vasilakis where they overpowered him and tortured him in a bathtub. They handcuffed him and they put lit cigarettes into his ears and his nostrils. They shoved a lit sparkler, which is like a little firecracker, in his urethra and injected bleach into his testicles. He was also wired up to a machine called a Variac, which gave electric shocks, and they shocked him. His toes were crushed with pliers before he choked to death on a rag. Before he died, he was made to make a recording like the others, farewell phone calls to loved ones. He was also made to reveal his PIN, And the album by Live Throwing Copper was playing as they murdered him. And apparently this was one of Bunting's favourites, and it was used for several of the victims. The trio went on to impersonate Frederick to access his welfare payments. Gary Dwyer was next. He was 29. He was both mentally and physically disabled, and he had the misfortune of being labelled a fag and dirty by Bunting. Now, the killers, the trio invited Gary over for drinks one night in October of 1998, and they pounced on him, where they proceeded to torture and kill him. Now, Vasilakis left halfway through to go to a party, and when he saw Bunting the next day, Bunting told him that Gary was good now, and apparently he had died, admitting that he was a rock spider. Now, Bunting also took off with some of Gary's furniture after they killed him, telling Vasilakis' mother that Gary had run into trouble with some of the local Aboriginals in the area and had to take off, therefore leaving his furniture behind. Gary was put into a barrel and stored at Hayden's house before eventually being moved to the bank in Snowtown. His welfare benefits were also stolen. Elizabeth Hayden was next. She was 37 and she was married to Mark Hayden, and even this didn't spare her life. Apparently, her husband told her about the murders, and he then went on to tell Bunting that he had told her about the murders, and for this, she had to go. Apparently, Wagner wasn't fond of her, and he often referred to his friend's wife as a whore and a lowlife. In November of 1998, Mark and her children had gone out for the evening, which Mark had pre-planned. And when he left, the others came into the house, where Elizabeth was dragged into her bathroom and she was tortured and killed. A rope was around her neck and a gag was in her mouth. And when Mark came home later on, they showed him his wife's body and he laughed. She was put in a barrel in the bank, and when asked where she was by family and friends and her children, they were told that she had run off with a boyfriend. It was around this time that police really started to focus on the trio, especially Bunting. Now, David Johnson was 24 and I believe was the killer group's last victim. He was Vasilakis' stepbrother, and Bunting hated him. He was clean, he was neat, he looked after himself, and for that, Bunting labelled him a yuppie and a faggot. Now, Bunting was obsessed with killing him. He wanted to kill him badly, and he convinced Vasilakis to tell David that there was a cheap computer for sale in Snowtown, and he wanted David to come along with him to check it out and get his opinion. David agreed, and they made their way to the bank that the two of the men had leased out. And when they walked into the empty bank where this computer supposedly was, David was set upon. He was tortured like the others. He was strangled, and he too was the victim of theft and fraud after he had died, and he was the only Snowtown victim that was actually killed in the bank, inside the bank. And like the others, his body was placed in a barrel. It's worth saying that the welfare fraud that these people committed after they murdered these victims was somewhere up around close to $100,000 that they had stolen off these people. The bodies have now been discovered. The whys and the hows and the whos have now been discovered, and all four were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, with Bunting and Wagner charged with 11 and 10 counts of murder each. Bunting confessed to 3. Hayden admitted 2 and Vasilakis confessed to 4. Okay, so the main trial started in 2002 and continued roughly into 2003. The trial lasted roughly 150 sitting days and featured 227 witnesses. One juror had to be excused because they could not handle the graphic details of the case. Now, in September 2003, a jury found Bunting guilty of 11 counts of murder, and Wagner was found guilty of 7 counts of murder. Mark Hayden was separately convicted of assisting in the disposal of the bodies and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Now, the judge, Justice Brian Martin, determined that Bunting was the ringleader and sentenced him to 11 life sentences with no chance of parole, and Wagner was sentenced to 7 life sentences with no chance of parole. The judge told the courtroom while handing down the sentence, "Your crimes were premeditated and a number of them involved considerable planning and preparation. I'm satisfied that both of you derived pleasure from the physical acts of killing and the violence and torture that preceded some of the killings. It's not an exaggeration to say you were in the business of killing for pleasure." Now, even in sentencing, even in knowing he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail, Wagner was defiant, telling the judge, "Pedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action. I took that action." Now, I have mentioned that Hayden was not convicted of murder, but for the cover-up and the involvement, he was sentenced to 25 years with a non-parole of 18 years for his involvement, and Vasilakis was sentenced to 4 life sentences with a non-parole period of 26 years. In May 2024, 65-year-old Mark Hayden was released on parole, much to the shock and disgust of many in the community and the victims' families. And in 2025, he had his parole conditions loosened, and he is now free to go to a pub, drink alcohol, doesn't have a curfew, and does not need to wear an ankle monitor. Initially, James Vasilakis had an image suppression order on his image due to his young age and the fact that he turned informant at the time of the trial. But in 2025, this suppression order was lifted, and now we can see what he looks like. Now, he applied for parole in 2025, which was blocked and is now before the Court of Appeal. Much to the disgust of the victims' families, who say they don't get to see their loved ones, so why should, they don't get to go have a cup of coffee or hang out with their loved ones, so why should James get to do the same? Why should he get to go out and have a life? If he is granted parole, James Vasilakis will be the first serial killer in Australian history to be granted parole. And when you say that out loud, it is actually literally insane. John Bunting and Robert Wagner are both serving their life sentences at the Yadalada Labor Prison in South Australia. They do not have the chance of parole, and they will spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Mark Hayden is out on parole. He's out in the community with fairly lenient parole conditions. And as for James's bid for parole, keep an eye on the news, guys. Google it. See what happens. It's before the appeals board as we speak, so any day there could be an update. There we have it, guys. The tale of 4 absolutely disgusting and vile men who, for whatever reason, the universe decided to bring together, and in their own fucked up, sick minds, justified murdering people they didn't like, or they wanted their money, or they thought was this, or they thought was that. I mean, it's just beyond, when you think about it, it is absolutely mind-blowing that these people found each other and this went on for as long as it did before they got caught. And it also blows my mind that during all these awful awful murders, these sadistic, torturous murders that nobody actually stopped. None of these four men stopped to go, oh, this is fucked up. What are we doing? Well, obviously, the two ringleaders who are in jail for the rest of their lives wouldn't, because they're fucking psycho. But the other two, Vasilakis and Hayden, I don't understand why they didn't put a stop to this. Or if they were worried for their own safety, why did they not, anonymously tip off the police and say, hey, this is going on? A few lives could have been saved by this, but they didn't. And that's fucking mind-blowing to me. But I guess that separates us from them, isn't it? Most of us would do that, and some of us would not. I mean, these murders really are a sad and gruesome part of Australian history, and so many people knew about them and nobody did anything. And I just think that is really sad. Sad for the victims and sad for the victims' families that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This wasn't, the case, like I said at the beginning, of them being plucked off the street by some psycho. They were murdered by people they knew. And nobody tried to help them. Nobody tried to stop this. It's just really sad, and it's really sickening what went on and how long it went on for, and how many players were involved in these murders. It really, really is. And that's it, guys. Another episode of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans done and dusted. Thank you for lending me your ears. And while I still have your ears, don't forget you can subscribe to me on YouTube. You can subscribe to me via Buzzsprout. And if you do subscribe to me over on Buzzsprout, you get bonus episodes, which are ghost stories. If you think our killers are nasty, wait until you meet our ghosts. You can send me fan mail. You can buy me a coffee. You can become a sponsor. And while I've got your ears for that little bit longer, I do have 2 books available, which are on my TikTok page. So find me on TikTok, check out my books, buy my books. My shameless self-promo done and dusted. And thank you again for your company, guys. I love hearing from you. So please do reach out if you feel the need. And until next time, guys, stay safe, stay cool. Please be kind to each other and yourselves. Stay caffeinated, and I will catch you all later.